All right, well, we've reached the top of the hour and we'll go ahead and get started. So today we'll be covering data ingestion tips and tricks. And in terms of our agenda for today, we will be looking at data formatting. We will be discussing the smart splitter monetary flows. And then we'll also be doing a Q&A around data ingestion to hopefully answer a lot of your questions about how to gain the most efficiencies using MindBridge in terms of getting data into the system. My name is Michael Batala. I'm a director in our Strategic Insights group and one of our resident CPAs. I've been with MindBridge the last 4 years, working closely with clients on different use cases that come up, and especially figuring out different data strategies with the clients. And joining me today is Wing. Go ahead, Wing.
Hi, my name is Wing Chan. I've been with MindBridge just under 5 years now, and through all the time I've been involved in pretty much everything involving data, from extraction to transformation, loading, analysis, and some troubleshooting. Today we'll be covering I'll cover the data formatting part of it. So first of all, let's start us off with a polling question. So the question we're interested in is, how does your organization handle data ingestion? Now, does each person handle their own data, or do you have each person do their own and the team handles it under special complex situations? Or do you have a team that handles it all? Or finally, if there's an other, I'm curious to hear what these others could be.
So as these results are coming in, we can see that normally every person in team is handling their own. It's garnered 60% of the response in today's call, which is expected. Working closely with a lot of the external auditors, these different teams are usually decentralized, and it's often easier to put in their own data as they're working through the software because they're more familiar with their clients' data. However, we have seen a lot of teams move to a centralized model because of the consistency in terms of the input related to MindBridge. So understanding the data components and how those fit into the system has led to a more centralized model. And we'll cover some of these different elements throughout today's presentation related to ETL.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let's get started with extraction. Michael, if you switch to the next slide, thank you. So the data side of the ingestion process begins at extraction. Getting the correct data extract can go a long way to having a smooth data ingestion. Some ERPs have a large variety of options, and some of them may or may not be providing you with the right information. And some of them use different or conflicting nomenclature. For example, what one ERP calls as effective date may not mean the same as the other. And often this leads to a lot of confusion as to what to extract and how to do it. So what we've done at MindBridge is we've updated a lot of our documentation based on the most common ERPs. So I don't know if everyone's seen this, but we have this section in our support guide. You can see the link here at the bottom that lists all the ERPs for our most common ERPs and the extraction and transformation guides. What we have listed here is just a partial list, but if there are others that you're interested in, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll definitely be happy to investigate, and provide more guides for them.
Yeah, one thing to note too, in terms of data strategies, is consolidating those ERPs that you work with as an external accountant, and essentially identifying the ones that fit best with our system and developing your data strategy around that. So for example, if you have 20% of your clients on NetSuite, well, we've got the export guide, and we can build a process around how to ingest those particular clients that are on NetSuite. So oftentimes it's a great exercise to go through your client base and see what systems they're working on and develop your engagement plan around these different ERPs.
Yes, and certainly these guides, as you're working out these engagement plans, you can certainly use those guides as part of the set of resources that you provide to your clients. One really important part of the engagement planning process is the financial management system pull down on that screen there. It's one of those things that we base a lot of our metrics on to determine which ERPs are most important to you. So one thing I'm not sure everyone realizes that you can actually type in an ERP in there, because obviously we don't have every single one listed, but if you have one that's not on that list, you can actually type it in and hit enter. And that way we can start tracking which if there are new ERPs or less common ones, or if they become more common, right? And certainly we can provide better resources as we get these metrics. And one final note on extraction has to do with PDFs. I would say please avoid them. They look good when printed out or when displayed on a screen. However, the underlying data in the PDF is usually quite messy. Structurally, it could even be as complex as just a list of a bunch of pixels on a screen. So from a data perspective, PDFs are definitely one to avoid as much as possible.
And Wing, just a quick question for me. Oftentimes clients ask about text files as well. Any thought on text files?
Text files are fine. Certainly, it depends on the text file. So CSV, tab separated files, and so on are text files. Those what we would call structured text files. So the rows and the columns are all very well defined. Where it gets a little more complex is a text file that is designed for a printer or for a human to look at. So think your classic report screen where at the beginning of the file it says page 1, and at the bottom there's a head, a footer, or so on. A lot of times these can be challenging because your columns aren't very clearly defined. So you can have, for example, if you have a really long column, it could spill into the next, and so on. It makes that data formatting quite difficult. We have tools and to handle a lot of these, but there are times where some of these can be quite challenging. So a text file that looks like it's designed for a screen or print usually quite often can be quite challenging.
And the most successful text files are ones that have delimiters, correct?
Absolutely.
And what's the best way to identify those delimiters?
Right. So it varies from system to system. Some systems can export CSVs really, really well, and they actually follow some standards. And a lot of there are systems out there that, although they say export to CSV, they actually do not format it properly, meaning that they don't put quotes around fields that need to have quotes, or they don't escape the commas properly, and so on. And so it's a bit of it's a case by case scenario here. We have tools to detect and correct most of these, but sometimes it could be hunting for that one needle in the haystack. For example, you could have 10 million rows and one line in there has a problem and it causes everything else to be corrupted. But typically with text files, what we're looking at is columns that flow, that overflow into another because of these delimiters. So in terms of delimiters, usually you want to pick something that's not in the data. So a pipe character is pretty good. Tab characters sometimes. Commas if you properly escape things. We also have a new feature where you can define a multi-character delimiter. In some cases, like for example, one of our customers uses the hash, like the number sign, the vertical bar, pipe, and hash. And the thinking behind that is that kind of data, that kind of combination of characters is very unlikely to show up in your data. So using a multi-character delimiter can be an advantage here. That's assuming that your systems will support that. But MindBridge has that capability that's new this year.
Great. So that gives us good detail around exports and different files to look for. One thing to note, if there is the need for data assistance, as Wing mentioned, we do have a number of tools internally. In the bottom left-hand corner of the MindBridge software, you'll be able to find Grant MindBridge Access, and that will give you direct access to our data team. We also have the support elements where you can ask these questions within the program if you need additional assistance formatting the data. So with that being said, we'll kind of move to our next slide here.
Yeah, let's talk about transformation. So MyBridge has a few built-in tools now that support data transformation. So one example is the merge files function. So often you can receive data that is split up into multiple files. This can happen because your ERP cannot extract larger files. Typically, ERPs are built to handle Excel files, so you're up to that million row limit, or even smaller, right? You're resorting to extracting data on a month by month or quarter by quarter, and I've even heard week by week basis for some of the larger files. This was one of the most common data transformation requests that we received at MyBridge. So what we did was we implemented a tool that makes it easier for you to concatenate all these files back into a single file. And to access this, it's fairly straightforward. So from the file manager, you just select the files as you see here. And then on the top right, under the actions menu, there is the merge button. And Michael, if you skip to the next slide, that will take you to the, it will take you through a set of wizard steps, and it lets you specify the parameters on how you would merge this. And the tool is quite sophisticated in that oftentimes if you in your extract, maybe you name the column header differently. The tool can actually let you select the columns that you actually want to, that mean the same thing across the different files. So there's a lot of sophistication built in here for you to take lots of separate files and join them all into one larger one. So MyBridge also provides some transformation tools that work within the file. For example, splitting a column by delimiter. This can happen quite often with, for example, an account ID field. On the left side, I have an account ID that is actually made up of an account ID, a sub-account ID, and a cost center, as an example. And it's separated by a dash as a delimiter. So with the split tool, you can specify that and select which one of the components you want to map to, for use in MyBridge. Likewise, you can also split by position. So in some cases, you don't get that delimiter, but for example, the first 5 characters is the account number, followed by the next 3 characters as a sub-account ID. And once again, you can select which components you want to include or in your analysis. Another function is the join function. So this would be the opposite of that split. You can take any number of columns and join them together. So I'm doing exact opposite here. I'm taking the account number, the account ID, and joining it with the cost center. And once again, you can specify the delimiter that is, or no delimiter at all. And finally, there is also a duplicate function. This can be helpful in cases where you have one column, but that can be mapped to different places. For one common example would be an effective date, where some systems, the effective date is the entry date, and so on. So that way, you can use that same field to apply to two different places. On to the next polling question. So how do you normally prepare data for polling? Do you typically use external tools and do all the work in there, or do you do all the preparation within MyBridge, or C, you use both, depending which is easier, or you try to do, or D, where you try to get as far as possible and then get MyBridge to finish the rest. Some people use direct connectors. Is that one of those things that you use most often, or once again, other? I'm curious to know how people use these tools.
Great. So the results are coming in, and it's looking like using external tools and a mixture of MyBridge tools to help get the data in seems to be the most prominent choice. In terms of data tools and ingestion, it looks like using external tools to get the data exactly as needed prior to ingestion and going back to external tools if more transformation is needed is the prominent choice. This is great to note because we're always looking on ways to improve the data ingestion within our tools and always looking to enhance the different features. As noted, Wing and I have been at MyBridge for 4 and 5 years, so we can definitely be able to see the changes and introduce new features accordingly, like the smart splitter, like the file manager, the ability to merge files, the ability to join and split columns within the data set. These have all come through customer requests. So we really enjoy the feedback. Great. So
there's a question in the chat. The question is, can MindBridge read SAS data sets? I presume you mean SAS as the ERP. I have seen it mentioned before. I'm not very familiar exactly with the structure of it. We would have to investigate a bit more. But I would imagine if it can be extracted in terms of something like a CSV file or some kind of format like that, that should not be a problem at all. Onto loading. So for a MindBridge analysis to work, it has a set of required columns, and you can also add additional columns. But one thing that I don't know if everyone's familiar with is the additional filtering columns. So these are categorical fields that will allow you to view your results through different lenses. Often they are represented by different business process or structures in your business and the data itself. So by selecting these columns for filtering, you can add a lot of different dimensionality to your analysis. A very simple example I have here is the state code, and for this particular fictional business, they wanted to look at the risks by various states. So by adding that as a filterable column, you could do that. And also you can build in your data table, you can build more sophisticated filters based off of that.
And this goes back to understanding your data strategy, because if you build the process around a specific ERP, you'll know what fields that ERP is able to provide. So for example, QuickBooks, you know that you're going to get the class and the name field that can be used as additional filters within the software. So going back to that data understanding is really a critical element in terms of identifying these unique fields that can be leveraged engagement to engagement.
Yeah, and certainly to add to that, I know there are a lot of SAP users out here as well, and there's a lot of additional columns like business references, transaction references, and so on. So a lot of these will provide that extra dimensions for you. The one thing about the filters is that there's a limitation that it's a categorical column. You don't want to put in a column that's an open text field or anything like that, because I mean, when you think about it, if you have millions of rows of data, to be able to filter by that, it becomes unwieldy for you anyway, right? So you want columns that are of a categorical in nature. A couple of questions in the chat. Hang on. Yes, an import template. We have considered that. We are looking at ways of implementing that kind of functionality. For example, one thing that has been discussed is a way to say copy the settings from the previous analysis, in terms of column mapping and so on. So yeah, definitely we have been looking at that. Thanks for bringing that up. Second question, capable of joining columns using the results from a split column. That has also been a request. That's not available yet. We'll have to look into that as well. Okay, on to integrity checks. So in the various stages of the loading process, MindBridge provides some integrity checks so that it helps as a check to make sure that there's no inconsistencies, whether it's structural or content point of view. So what you want to do is, as you're loading the data, you want to make sure that all of these check marks are turned green. For the most part, I mean, there are going to be exceptions, but if there are exceptions, you should at least know where they're coming from. On my example on the left here, the second one is flagging something because it says that most of my rows have 12 columns, but there's one row that has 13. In this particular example, it's a very good indicator, especially because it's a CSV file, that there's probably a comma that showed up in a memo field somewhere and it didn't get escaped properly. And then this one is actually quite a common issue with text files. And as Michael's question earlier, with text files, they're great, but sometimes you run into issues like this. So these integrity checks are very, very important for you to look at in terms of making sure that the formatting is done correctly. On the right side, at the transaction ID stage, there are also a set of integrity checks. This one's showing that some transactions are unbalanced, but quite often we also see where transactions span over multiple effective dates. And usually that's a sign of whether the transaction ID scheme that you picked is not great, or if the effective date definition is incorrect. So those are all warning signs that there could be some underlying data issue, and that you should try to understand that first before moving onwards. Okay, on to the next set. Another set of checks that we find very useful, certainly when we're doing transformation, is the completeness check report. You can get it in two different places. One is pre-analysis, and one is in the reports after you have your analysis. In the pre-analysis, it's in your data page under the three dots menu, and under import checklist, you can see the pre-analysis completeness check section. What this tells you is there's a lot of things that this report can help you in terms of identifying common errors. For example, a lot of systems will give us opening or closing balances as entries in the GL. That will show up as it will show up as the fail in the account balanced in this report. And quite often you'll see that the numbers may line up in a certain way. For example, the difference is exactly the amount, or something like that. And another common challenge we see is that signs are flipped. For example, revenues are, we typically expect revenue amounts to be on the negative side, being a credit balance. But sometimes, depending on the system, it would extract it as a positive. And so and this would also show up in the completeness check, where your numbers don't balance, or they're exactly twice the amount of the difference. So be sure to check the completeness check report. Ideally, you want everything to be true here. Now, the completeness check report also depends on your opening and closing balance files. So you also need to make sure that those files are first of all in sync with the GL. So sometimes through the audit process, there could have been adjustments already made or have not been applied yet. And so sometimes the entries in the general ledger, maybe they were not extracted at the same time the trial balances were received. So sometimes there's a bit of out of sync issues. So so that you make the completeness check useful, you need to make sure that those files are taken at the same time. If not, I mean, it's not too hard to reconcile, but it's certainly something that you want to keep in mind. And then the final thing is the income statement accounts. MyBridge expects them to be zeroed out, so that when it calculates the completeness check, those numbers will line up as well.
Yeah, and this is a really great report because it's recalculating everything at an account by account basis. So a lot of accounting firms will just roll over retained earnings and not check every single account if retained earnings does roll. So this is able to capture a lot of those different errors that may have occurred in terms of the audit adjustments. Did they book it to the right account in the prior period, and is it consistent with what we have in our previous ending balance, which is used in the opening balance in the current period? So it's a great check on an account by account basis. And once again, we're recalculating all the activity from the current ledger. Another report that's relevant and found in the same area as the completeness check report is our interim roll forward check. And what's nice about that check is, once again, we're looking at the detail found within the files and being able to identify if anything's been added, changed, or removed from that interim file to the full year ledger. So these are a few reports that we would recommend looking at in the report section to validate the completeness of data from your interim period or in just the completeness of the general ledger file in general. So we've got our next polling question here. For non-audit use cases, how is data ingestion handled? A is every person slash team handling their own data. B, normally every person team handles their own data unless a complex or special situation, and we have internal resources to assist. C, a centralized process that handles most, if not all, data ingestion, and a team that the auditor's ingestion does the non-audit ingestion as well. D, we have a centralized process that handles most, and if not all, data ingestion, and the non-audit related ingestion has their own team. And E, not applicable because we're only using MindBridge for audit and review engagements. So give everybody a second to answer this question. And it looks like we do have a number of users working on non-audit use cases. Looks like we have had a flip in the polling question here. So I'm seeing timing. We've got this flip, so we'll come back to this one at a later date. But the question that I believe everybody else is seeing is related to the timing of the data. And it looks like the average amount of time spent is between 1 and 2 hours. Great, so we'll continue moving forward here because of timing. And next we'll get into the monetary flows and the smart splitter. So the monetary flows is really important underlying concept found within MindBridge. Essentially, a monetary flow represents the movement of one account to another. And this can be represented by a simple transaction that's a single debit and credit. And to be considered a monetary flow in our system, each line, the debits and credits must match. In more complex system, MindBridge is actually going through and identifying assumed pairs, conditional pairs, and just general pairs found within the data set. So one of the things that MindBridge is doing, every time a general ledger is uploaded, we're actually analyzing the relationships found within that ledger. And that's very unique. And this monetary flows ends up in multiple different places within the tool. One, we'll discuss with the smart splitter in just a second, the ability to break down these monetary flows. And then within the program in the actual analysis, the monetary flows affects the rare flow. It affects the outlier anomaly, so the machine learning components. It affects the transaction structure found in the prior period comparison, as well as on the financial statement tab, the monetary flows tab. So this is an important concept to understand is how do we create a strong monetary flow or identify the monetary flows clearly through the data set that's being ingested. And in order to do that, we first need to understand what monetary flows are. So this is an example of a transaction that can be entered into or is entered into a general ledger. You know, we can see here we have essentially two different entries associated with the same transaction. We've got the union expense, the union payable, we've got the wage expense, you know, the payment from the bank, as well as the income tax payable. When matching a debit and credit, MindBridge can use this information to learn more about the understanding operations. So for example, a credit to a credit card and a debit to an office expense implies office expenses were purchased on the credit card, of course. So understanding that's a typical business process will help us identify those rare flows, the outliers related to these relationships occurring. And what's unique is the way that we detect the monetary flow. So this transaction here is not one monetary flow within MindBridge. It's actually multiple monetary flows. The $50 for the union expense and the payable is a unique monetary flow in terms of paying union expenses. A second monetary flow is the $800 related to the bank and the wages expense account. And the third monetary flow is the income tax payable and the wages expense. So although this is one transaction, MindBridge is looking at this as three monetary flows to help understand and get deeper into the data, which is going to allow us to take that human-centric approach, right? Our system's not looking at this as one transaction. You as an auditor would not look at this as one transaction. You would be doing a similar breakdown in your mind of, okay, these two accounts are interacting, these three accounts are interacting. What is the relationship? What is the process found within these different accounts? So this concept is really important because it impacts multiple areas. In terms of pairs, conditional pairs, and assumed pairs, what does that mean? So a pair is if we see just a single debit and credit. So let's say union expense and union payable came through as its own transaction. That would be a pair, and we would count, check that off as a pair. An assumed pair is what we're seeing in this, or I'm sorry, a conditional pair is what we're seeing in this particular transaction. Although there's multiple line items, we can see that the union expense and union payable are obviously linked. So that would be a conditional pair. And then the assumed pair is what we're seeing with the wage expense, the bank, and the income tax payable, right? We've got 1,800 and 200. However, we're looking at this as two monetary flows, where we've got an assumed pair with wage expense and bank, as well as wage expense and an income tax payable. So it's important to understand these concepts in terms of monetary flows within our tool. And this will take us into our next polling question, which is one that we've already seen, but you guys got a taste of the other one. So why don't we go ahead and answer that question, and then we'll move into the smart splitter. So I'll give everybody just a couple minutes here, and then we'll discuss how monetary flows can impact the smart splitter, which is part of the data ingestion process. And we will be going back through, we've got a number of other questions in our Q&A, and we will take some time to answer those questions throughout the Q&A portion of this presentation. Please continue to populate the Q&A or the chat box with different questions that you may have, as Wing and I will look to answer and give you perspective on your specific question from our experience. Great, so it looks like we've got a strong response right there, and everybody's taking care of the polling question. We'll go ahead and circle back on that in the Q&A, and we'll continue on to the smart splitter. So the smart splitter is another unique concept found within MindBridge. The smart splitter is essentially the ability to take a transaction or create different transaction structures within our system. Oftentimes, you'll have a client that doesn't have a transaction ID, and the smart splitter can be used to create a transaction ID. Or you have clients that have large batch transactions with individual line items where, let's say we've got 30 different expenses and one payable. It becomes more manageable to break that down into 30 unique transactions. That way we get more granularity in terms of the analysis. So where does the smart splitter found? It's found during the data ingestion process in the review of the data. So in the review of the data, we're able to select the different columns that are relevant in terms of the transaction identifier, and then we are able to run the smart splitter. Typically, I recommend running the smart splitter on a cleaner data set. So if you have strong transaction structures, it's a great tool to help break down the data and create more granularity in terms of the analysis. If your client or if your organization's data set is already relatively clean and you want to maintain the structure of that data set, then we would obviously not recommend using the smart splitter in those situations. However, how does this impact the analysis? By default, the field map to the transaction column would be used to group the line items into distinct transactions. So if there's not a transaction identifier or there's multiple transaction identifiers, it's best to see which one would help break down the data set and create the granularity in terms of the monetary flows, because that's going to impact the analysis and the accuracy of the analysis. So here's a look at the smart splitter within the tool on the right-hand side. We can see in this case, we do have a transaction ID structure. And once again, selecting that transaction ID structure and then running the smart splitter, our system will automatically break down these large transactions into micro transactions. The way that it'll be structured is, let's say this is transaction 1000, it'll be 1000-1, 1000-2. So you're always able to tie it back to the original transaction. And oftentimes when you have large group transactions, these transactions can limit the ability to accurately assess and score a risk score because of unrelated entries that are grouped. As you'll see in just a minute, if MindBridge, the default scoring system is to take the highest risk score in the entries within a transaction. So if there's multiple different monetary flows and there's a high risk relationship, it's elevating the whole transaction to be high risk. So using the smart splitter will help us separate out the monetary flow within that transaction that is not as high of risk, to once again narrow the scope of the auditor's work. And then as we can see here, monetary flows can be improved by leveraging the smart splitter to create a higher level of accuracy in the pairs, assumed pairs, and conditional pairs. I have an example of the monetary flows in just a second, but one of the best use cases that I see is a lot of these ERPs will not create transaction IDs for you. For example, in QuickBooks, it's actually an optional field to have a transaction ID. And it's not a limitation of getting or having an analysis run within MindBridge. So for those less complex entities, we can go ahead and piece together key elements of it. Of the general ledger. In QuickBooks, I often use the day and the type of transaction to consolidate all the different types of transactions and then run the smart splitter. And we're essentially able to recreate every single transaction that's happened in that day. So it's a really nice tool when you have less complex entities in order to break down and create those transaction identifiers and the ability to get to an analysis. The smart splitter is something that we introduced because we saw this as a common error. Once again, going back to the feedback from our clients, it was a common error that we recognized within our client base using QuickBooks, and we wanted to help correct that issue. Not only on QuickBooks, we see this in other, typically legacy tools that lack the transaction structures, and we didn't want to create that limitation within our program. So as my example, using the day and the type is a great way, and then run the smart splitter, you're also able to select different criteria. So if you want if you have a document number and date, that's also another great kind of pairing in terms of leveraging the smart splitter because that creates a very specific criteria in terms of breaking down the data. So here's an example of the smart splitter's impact on the monetary flow. As we can see here, we've got the original entry and the smart splitter entry. On the original entry, on the left-hand side of the screen, we've got 4 different lines and 4 different accounts that make up the debits and credits. As we can see on the right-hand side, we actually separate out those transactions into 2 unique transactions. So similar to what we saw in the monetary flow earlier, we were able to separate the union expense through the actual payroll expense that was happening. And that's exactly what the smart splitter is able to do. But what's different about just looking at the monetary flows versus looking at the smart splitter is the way that the scoring works within the tool. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see that original transaction without the smart splitter would have had a high risk score because journal entry 123 is a high risk transaction because of one of the relationships. Versus if we look at the smart splitter, breaking it down into 2 transactions, we have 1 higher risk score transaction and 1 low risk score transaction. So in the actual analysis, you're going to have this breakdown versus, so you're going to have the profile of 1 high risk transaction and 1 low risk transaction in the system instead of 1 high risk transaction that's got multiple line items that are not necessarily risky. So it's once again pointing the auditor or the user into the correct direction in terms of why this transaction is risky, and it's giving you a perspective on that. Another great tool to leverage here is we can see the dates within this transaction are different. So you can use an effective date as a parameter to help split the transaction as well. So let's say we've got a client that records an entry at the end of each month. And they have a controller or accounting manager that likes to book just a 1 entry with all the different days and kind of record it into the tool at the same time or into the accounting system. It's something that we're also able to separate out within our program. So the Smart Splitter is a really great tool to help you consolidate the results and break down the information to get the most granular analysis in that human-centric approach that we really tout here at MindBridge. Wing, I know, so many of you probably don't know this, but Wing is one of the developers that was involved with the Smart Splitter. Any other situations that you've seen that are relevant that you kind of designed the Smart Splitter around?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it helps identify some of these potentially hidden structures within the transaction. So this is a case where it's quite well ordered. It has also been applied in cases where there's absolutely no other choice, I guess, for lack of a better description. So Smart Splitter was able to there are some systems that are pretty much fully batch entry with where it's basically take all your monetary flows, log them all in the same time period, and toss out all the information that would otherwise separate them. So there are systems that kind of get data to us that way, and we found that Smart Splitter was at least able to make some sense of it. I would say it's not ideal because systems like that is just very hard to work with. But we've been able to make some use out of that kind of data.
Yeah, so if you haven't currently used a Smart Splitter, it's I'd recommend running it and seeing the impact on your analysis. Before you even get to the analysis, when you do select the Smart Splitter, you can always go back to the original if you're not comfortable with the results that it produced. So there is the ability to evaluate the Smart Splitter and the way that the transactions change. Most typically, if you take a look at the transactional volumes in the review of the data, we tell you whether it's a single debit and credit, or there's 3 line items up to, I think it's 1,000+ line items in transactions. And you'll see the structure really shift to the left, and you'll see more pairs built from the Smart Splitter than you previously had in the data set. Once again, this doesn't change the underlying format of the general ledger because you're still able to identify the original transaction. This is more for MindBridge to help consolidate the results to point you in the right direction. So it's not changing the foundational qualities of the general ledger. It's just separating things out in a cleaner fashion. So you're always able to get to the original transaction within the tool.
Yeah, and I just want to add that there are some counter examples for using Smart Splitter. Some systems have what is called a transaction or monetary flow very well defined. In those situations, you may not want to apply Smart Splitter by adding more more structure to it, and taking the information as is from those ERPs may actually be the better choice. So as Michael alluded to earlier, the understanding the monetary flows, this is very important, right? You need to understand what the batches are and what is the root of it, right? And and act accordingly. So it's not always always use this or not use it. There's going to be some bit of a judgment call in between.
Yep, great. So with that being said, we'll move over to our Q&A. We've got a number of different questions that have come throughout the presentation that we will jump into. The very first one that we'll start with is, do QuickBooks Desktop and QuickBooks Online need different transformations? So this is an interesting question related to QuickBooks Desktop and QuickBooks Online. QuickBooks Online is one of our original direct connectors that we have. So you are able to directly connect with QuickBooks Online where no data manipulation is required. And then in terms of QuickBooks Desktop, that is also an auto read file in our system using the QuickBooks Journal report. So we'll auto format the group data set that comes through on the journal entry report. So there is not really transformations required of those particular data sets.
Sorry, I also want to add in here, and this is probably a prime example of nomenclature differences. A lot of times QuickBooks has a general ledger export, which is not the one we want. It's the journal, I think it's called the journal transaction report, which is the one we want. So once again, a plug for our ERP guides. Please look in there for the reports that MindBridge requires, because a lot of times people end up going down the wrong path, and it does get a little difficult that way.
Yeah, that's a great point, is leveraging that export guide, because it is a little bit different than just a detailed general ledger export. It is a unique format that we've built into the tool to try to mirror the QuickBooks entries as best as possible. Another question that came up earlier was related to, let me go ahead and scroll up here. Do you have any in-person training or workshops to new customers so that they can stand by themselves when doing data ingestion? Yes, so our goal is always to make the user self-sufficient within our tool. Obviously, in terms of our approach, it's really there to augment the auditor or the user. And we want to make sure that user has the ability to do everything that they need to do themselves without relying on MindBridge. Whether this is the data science elements or it comes down to data ingestion. So on the data ingestion side, the very first starting point would be, as a customer, you're typically assigned a customer success manager, and that customer success manager will walk you through the data ingestion process. In addition to that walkthrough of the process, we have the MindBridge Academy, which highlights a number of different training videos on data ingestion. So it breaks down account groupings, it breaks down the smart splitter, different data formats, data transformation. There also is a tips and tricks video within there, which is more functional related than what we've discussed today in terms of go-to specials and some of the common data manipulation that's needed to run an analysis within our system. So, there is vast amounts of training that is required or available for using MindBridge. And then, Wing, anything to add to that question from your perspective as a data lead?
No, you mentioned all the resources that we have. Yeah.
And the next question that came in is there a way to automate ingestion, for example, from a SQL server or a data factory? And Wing's excited to hop in here, so I'll let him take this.
Yeah. With the API, there will be a release upcoming where you can actually load data directly from you can load data by calling the REST API directly. Right now, you can go as far as loading it into the file manager. So if you have a SQL server, you could probably write the recommendation from SQL is that you don't call out from SQL Server. You probably want to use something like SSIS and build a transformation package, or even better, write some C# code that will pull data from your SQL Server and read it, and then call the MindBridge REST API directly and push that data across. So I'm actually really excited about this because I'm looking at a lot of options now to go directly from SQL into MindBridge. We're starting to explore some of these possibilities in the very, very short term.
Great. So looks like we're just about to time here, and we appreciate everybody's time today. Hopefully this gave you a better perspective on different elements within the data ingestion process. Once again, if you need further information, please feel free to reach out to Wing or myself. Or explore our knowledge base or MindBridge Academy for more detailed videos around the data ingestion process. And also later this afternoon, we've got our Ask Our MindBridge Anything session at 2:30 Eastern time for any follow-up questions that you may have for our industry experts. So we've got a number of different breakout rooms around different topics to help you understand the MindBridge software at much greater detail. So once again, thank you everybody for your time and have a great rest of your MindBridge Edge.